These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down, get off.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, Thinking with Ella Baker. Africa World Now Project is next.
Brothers and sisters in the struggle for human dignity and freedom, I am here to represent the struggle that has gone on for 300 or more years, a struggle to be recognized as citizens in a country in which we were born. I have had about 40 or 50 years of struggle, ever since a little boy on the streets of Norfolk called me a nigger. I struck him back, and then I had to learn that hitting back with my fist one individual was not enough. It takes organization. It takes dedication. It takes the willingness to stand by and do what has to be done when it has to be done. A nice gathering like today is not enough. You have to go back and reach out to your neighbors who don't speak to you. And you have to reach out to your friends who think they are making it good, and get them to understand that they, as well as you and I, cannot be free in America or anywhere else where there is capitalism and imperialism until we can get people to recognize that they themselves have to make the struggle and have to make the fight for freedom every day in the year, every year, until they win it. Thank you.
Attempts to distort, rewrite, dilute, misdirect, and misguide the impact of our radical scholars, radical thinkers, activists, artists, and advocates are carefully planned practices by those who hold perceived positions of authority. The exclusion of important Africana thinkers and activists is not a matter of simple exclusion, but a matter of intentional attempts to disrupt the continuities of radicalization and the invocation of their ideas that could be stretched to fit the conditions within which Africana peoples find themselves at a given point in time and space. Folk often lament, why don't they teach us this information? Why don't they teach us this history, these ideas? My response is always the same. Why would they? Why would those in position of authority allow and promote access to what are considered radical ideas? What these folk are really doing with this question is highlighting the essence of the central contradictions in the philosophical basis of Western European education, the relationship with and narrow understanding of power, something that Ella Baker spent her life exposing and turning on its head, in word and deed, as model and archetype, as ancestral interlocutor, and memory keeper of those who came before her and those who come after. Her praxis is a guide and critique of what we must do in this category of time called now. Ella Baker words from a speech titled The Black Woman in the Civil Rights Struggle, delivered at the Institute of the Black World in 1969, are still sharply true today. Ms. Baker reasoned that in order for us as poor and oppressed people to become a part of a society that is meaningful, the system under which we now exist has to be radically changed. This means that we are going to have to learn to think in radical terms. She goes on to intentionally clarify what she meant by radical as to not to cause anyone to be confused. Ms. Baker said, "I use the term radical in its original meaning, getting down to and understanding the root cause. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system." Barbara Ransby, one of the world's preeminent thinkers and activists, writes in Ella Taught Me, shattering the myth of the leaderless movement, that those who romanticize the concept of leaderless movements often misleadingly deploy Ella Baker's words. Strong people don't need a strong leader. Baker delivered this message in various iterations over her 50-year career working in the trenches of struggle. But what she meant was specific and contextual. She was calling for people to disinvest from the notion of the Masonic charismatic leader who promises political salvation in exchange for deference. Baker also did not mean that movements would naturally emerge without collective analysis, serious strategizing, organizing, mobilizing, and consensus building. Professor Ransby, who also wrote the important Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement, A Radical Democratic Vision, suggests that Ella Baker spent her entire adult life trying to change the system as rooted in exploitation, oppression, and the idea that whiteness equals supremacy. Somewhere along the way, she recognized that her goal was not a single end, but rather an ongoing means, that is, a process. Radical change for Ella Baker was about a persistent and protracted process of discourse, debate, consensus, reflection, and struggle. If larger and larger members of communities were engaged in such a process, she reasoned, day in and day out, year after year, the revolution will be well underway. Ella Baker understood that laws, structures, and institutions had to change in order to correct injustice and oppression. But part of the process had to involve oppressed people, ordinary people, infusing new meanings into the concepts of democracy, and I add justice and what it means to be human, and finding simultaneously individual and collective power to determine their lives and shape the direction of history, employing an Africana critical human rights consciousness, if you will. In addition to Professor Ransby's work, it is vital and essential that I highlight and call attention to the work of Joanne Grant, who provided us with not only a number of books on the U.S. Civil Rights Manifestation of the Africana Freedom Movement, including Black Protests, History, Documents, and Analysis, 1619 to the Present, written in 1968, Ella Baker, Freedom Bound, written in 1989, Confrontation on Campus, The Columbia Pattern for the New Protests, written in 1969. But she produced an important documentary film titled Fundi, The Story of Ella Baker. Joanne Grant, a radical journalist and activist of African descent who served as an assistant to W.E.B. Du Bois upon returning from the 6th World Festival of Youth and Students in Moscow in 1957, who wrote about lynching in the South, visited China, Cuba, India, and the African continent when U.S. citizens were not allowed to. She was a member of the Communist Party, which made her a target of the House Un-American Activities Committee, was an author, documentary filmmaker, is yet another important link in the genealogy of Black radical praxis that have continuities not only with diaspora exemplars such as, but not limited to, Ella Baker, Septima Clark, Fannie Lou Hamer, Sylvia Hill, Queen Mother Moore, Maddie Hall Zuma, but continental Africa as well, Winnie Mandela, Miriam Makeba, Mariama Ba, to name a few. The breadth and depth of Africana radical praxis has barely been scratched, yet folk tend to write and talk as if they are providing the definitive word or thought on subjects they have not really begun to understand. It must not be lost, as highlighted at the beginning of this introduction, this position is intentional. Today, in response to a screening of Fundi, the story of Ella Baker, Africa Vote Now project co-sponsored this past August, we will listen to a conversation I had with Zach Norris where we explored the continuities and the praxis of Ella Baker. Zach Norris is the executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, author of We Keep Us Safe, Building Secure, Just, and Inclusive Communities, and co-founder of Restore Oakland, a community advocacy and training center that empowers Bay Area community members to transform local economic and justice systems and make a safe and secure future possible for themselves and their families. Zach is also a co-founder of Justice for Families, a national alliance of family-driven organizations working to end our nation's youth incarceration epidemic. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program.
Thank you, Zach, for joining us tonight and to have this discussion, a very important discussion, of course, about Ella Baker. In the context of the film that the film festival is viewing or showing or screening this year, Fundi, of course. You got a chance to see that film. And one of the things that I like to do, particularly when I'm engaging with folk and engaging with audiences in forums like this, is I really like it to be very organic. I think it's very important for us to have a conversation as opposed to kind of like be the repository or the one who knows everything. Because to be honest with you, me and you sitting here in the context of talking about Ella Baker, there are a number of women, obviously, that should be in this particular space as well. But of course, we know we have Barbara Ransby, who has done a lot of important work on Ella Baker. We know that SNCC itself, the SNCC digital platform or the digital access gateway that is, I think, just coming out of Duke, is housed at Duke, is available for people to, engage with, to understand what SNCC is and what it, and how it developed, who were the actors, and things like that. And so we can get started really, really quick. It's just a quick little question. Who was Ella Baker, just in a snapshot? Who was Ella Baker?
It's hard to snapshot Ella Baker because she was a veteran over so many decades of struggle for freedom for all people in the US and globally. She, helped lead NAACP, worked at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was a mentor to SNCC within the civil rights and Black freedom movements. And she believed in the power of everyday people to make change. And so she was, in many ways, this educator who didn't want to be in front of the classroom, like, in the sense of like Paulo Freire and radical democratic education. She would ask more questions and do more listening than she would do speaking, but would still be able to move a room and a crowd and a movement through her leadership. And to me, that is kind of the most impactful way of building movement ultimately, is that we need everyone's participation to make it go. And she really believed that and understood it and embodied it in all of her work.
And one of the things, and I wanted to give a shout out to Joanne Grant, who actually made the film Fundi, and it's a very important film. It really gives us a very, very important view, because number one, it allows Ella Baker to talk for herself, right? To say who she is, who she was. But there are a few things in the film that I would like to touch on, because they seem to have spilled over, particularly the gender dynamic of making, how Ella Baker seemed to be marginalized, or actually what I shouldn't say seemed to be, she was marginalized based upon, this old guard, these, the reverend, or the preacher class, we shouldn't say. Yeah. And I think that is very, very important in the context that we'll probably read that into the conversation. So you mentioned a very important point here. You talked about movement building. You talked about Ella Baker understood that organic process. She understood not necessarily in the traditional sense of the institutional or limited sense of what a teacher is, but she also, her philosophy of education was something that was rooted and guided her as she was moving throughout her life. Could you talk a little bit about, you know, her fundamental understanding of education in the context of movement building?
Yeah. You know, this Ella Baker uh, grew up in a time when it was almost expected for Black women, if they were of a certain class, to be teachers, right? To be, that was kind of like seen as the highest aspiration for Black women. And she very much rejected that and said, you know, rejected it on a couple of fronts. One, because she did not want to be kind of pigeonholed and confined as a Black woman in that way, but also because I think she rejected the traditional approach of education, which, you know, was kind of like a banking approach where I'm the teacher, students listen, I speak, and you take notes and memorize and that kind of thing. And she really rejected that model of education and that model of change, really. And so, as you mentioned, she really pushed back against the kind of patriarchal leadership that was reflected in a lot of the kind of preacher class, as you called it. Or I've seen the pictures of the like big six, right, from the civil rights movement, where it's all six Black men standing next to each other as kind of the sort of patriarchs of the movement. And she believed that the most powerful way to actually produce change was not through, you know, giving the grandest speech, but really by engaging with people and ensuring that folks felt they had the tools and did have the tools to make the change themselves. And her mentorship of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee really reflected that. It reflected that kind of ethos around asking questions and listening, especially her being more of an elder to the students who were forming SNCC at that time.
And that's important because you mentioned this banking concept, and of course, the first thing, and of course, as we kind of read widely and understand Ella Baker in the context of a longer tradition, we can even look at SNCC as being something within the tradition of in 1942. You had the Southern Negro Youth Congress that was formulated in Richmond, Virginia, in 1937, which was basically within the context of the same thing that these young folk were facing. You had, you know, the leadership of the big movements that were happening. You had SELC. You had those the organizations who wanted the youth to really be a part of their organization. But Ella Baker kind of was like, well, no, we have to allow. And she stood in that particular place because she saw something, right? She saw that energy. Could you talk a little bit more about how she was able to really kind of hone that energy of that critical consciousness concept that Paulo Freire talks about in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, because you talked about the banking concept.
Yeah.
So she saw that, right? So she kept feeding that and really stood in the way.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, here's a time in which, you know, there's 4 students who basically decide we're going to do this new thing and call it a sit-in and protest, right? And so there's all this energy around this tactic, and people are like, whoa, that's too fast, that's too much. Like, but at the same time, it like instantly galvanized so many people around, oh, we can do this and we can directly confront segregation in a particular way. And I think, as you said, there was this immediate reaction to like co-opt, and almost like when you hear like people now saying defund the police, and then other folks come along and say, well, actually what they mean is this, that, and the other. It's like, well, you know, why don't you actually listen to, you know, and there's this almost kind of knee-jerk reaction when something seems radical and transformative or too much for certain folks to kind of step in and say, you know, well, actually what is meant by this, or to kind of serve in a kind of co-opting way. And I think she very much was instrumental, because those young folks were still kind of coming into their own and still understanding their power and positionality. And to have an elder who was respected, who had been through decades of struggle, really say, no, this is an energy and a space that needs to be developed, I think was fundamental for the success of the Black freedom movement and freedom movements periods during that period.
And what's interesting is that these young folk, right, were at a particular time, right? If we look at the civil rights movement as it was, or the civil rights manifestation, as I like to call it, the Black freedom movement, this particular point was very important because you also had the movement itself in the broader terms, as represented by Dr. King, SELC, CORE, and NAACP, these types of organizations, is that you had a growing sense amongst the people that things are not moving fast enough or change is not moving in a certain context.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because even in the movie, and of course, when you read about Ella Baker and how how men described her as being hard to deal with, right? Being someone that, even in the film, they called her a lay person, right? And these are individuals you had, not C.T. Vivian, I'm sorry, the names are escaping right now.
Yeah.
Some of the folk we actually know who were the leaders.
Yeah.
And so she was able to, and also she was talking with her friend in Alabama, I think it was, and how she was saying how she was able to gravitate and mold that energy, mold that sense. And I think that is important because, what can you say more about that? Because we're actually in that moment right now, because you link that to here. As a leader in an organization, how do you manage that in a certain context?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that to me is critical is her focus on listening and her focus on believing in folks' capacity to achieve what so many would regard as impossible, right? And so that demand for immediate change. And I think about our work at the Ella Baker Center when it's been the best and when I feel like we have been, true to being named after Ella Baker, because that's a really high bar to set for a movement organization. And some of our best work, I feel like, has come when we have suspended disbelief and been like, we're going to ride with this demand. And one example of that is coming out of law school, I was hired as an organizer with the Ella Baker Center. And we were talking with families of incarcerated young people. And families driving, 250 miles on average, seeing their kids locked up for weeks and months on end, seeing young people being rearrested 1 year after release from these youth prisons and being abused, and unfortunately young people dying inside of these youth prisons, disproportionately Black folks, disproportionately Latinx communities, and mothers and grandmothers, partners, aunties, all said, look, we want to close these youth prisons down. And this was at the turn of the century, the height of the super predator mythology, all of that. And, we really believed that that was possible, took it up as a campaign, and over a decade-long struggle, we're able to close 5 of 8 youth prisons across the state of California. And that to me was indicative of this kind of process. And some of the community-driven research work that we've done, I think, is indicative of the kind of process that Ella Baker herself would have believed in and supported. Because for so long, she defied tradition. She defied being defined as within a particular ideology, but really believed in democracy in its most radical forms, right? And believed in the power of people to make change. And that's what I feel like is really reflected. And if you're going to really do that, you're going to come up against powerful people who don't like you, right? Because they got, not that their agenda isn't necessarily long-term transformative, and they, at the end of the day, want some of the same things. But sometimes all of us can take shortcuts, right, in that process as movement leaders, where we're like, well, we just need to get to here. And she was really about building the power of people, because ultimately that is what makes democracy work, and she understood that.
And one of the things that popped out to me, and you mentioned community, you mentioned, the ideas that she was bringing people together. And one of the African concepts, the South African concept I thought about specifically is that she really embodied, this principles of Ubuntu, meaning that I am because we are. And not only that, she also was somebody that really was able to really understand the basic human principle, because she said this: it is the right of a human being to resist, right? So organizing that becomes very, very important. So could you talk a little bit about her humanistic or her human rights perspective that she held and really, really developed and fomented over the course of her life?
Yeah. Um, you know, People often quote the Ella Baker in saying, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest," right? And she said right before that, until the killing of a black man is seen as important, the black mother's son is seen as important of the killing as a white mother's son. We who believe in freedom cannot rest, or something to that effect. And I think the beauty of her commitment to human rights was that she was also committed to making it plain and to making it relevant, to people's lived experience, right? And so I think, especially in the US, where there's such a US exceptionalism and a way in which human rights is seen as this kind of other thing that's out there, the United Nations kind of like, and that's intentionally fomented, right, by our um, by the regimes that have kind of ruled the day inside the United States, that they want human rights to be seen as kind of fringe and out there. But she really brought a perspective on human rights that was connected to folks' direct experience, and was able to organize with students and sharecroppers alike, because she listened more than talked, but also because she related and could bring these concepts of human rights back to an everyday kind of kitchen table conversation.
And that contradiction that you just raised, right, is as being the United States and its regimes and the different entities that make up the power elite here in the United States look at human rights as being something other, but yet proliferate a talk about the language around the world. So Ella
Mhm.
Baker was very clear
Mhm.
about calling out those contradictions. She
Yeah.
wrote, people also like to talk about that dominant, bigger than a hamburger, right? She was anti-capitalist, right?
Mhm.
She was very clear. She was a clear
Yeah.
radical in her worldview,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And supported the Puerto Rican independence movement, and um, really understood like human rights in the sense that all of us should understand it, right? Not as just civil political rights, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. And so understood the right to housing, the right to food, the right to live dignified lives in all of its forms. And that is something that I think is being taken up now in this moment, in terms of the movement for Black Lives platform, and really pushing for this kind of defund the police and refund the people agenda, right? And that is really fundamentally tied to supporting folks' basic human rights, and understanding that if we actually supported universal health care, if we actually provided folks with housing, um, decent employment opportunities, if we provided and took care of the public, we would also be taking care of public safety, right? And in that sense, I feel like so many folks, Patrice Cullors and Alicia Garza, and so many of the Black women who are helping to build Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives, Margaret Stolly Butts, are really taking up Ella Baker's legacy, and continuing in her tradition.
So I wanted to also make sure that those who are with us on this particular call, because it looks like we have about 52 people that are joining us, that if they have any questions or any insight or anything, because we're right now we're freestyling, and so
Yeah.
if they want to throw some words out and throw some ideas out that we can integrate into the conversation, we greatly appreciate that, because we also want to make sure that this is a conversation. Again, we are not to stop all, the end all of Ella Baker and what Ella Baker was and what she represents, right? We are just people who are having conversations, but also recognizing that we are two guys who are sitting here talking about an extraordinary woman when you actually have this history.
Yeah, check it. I ain't even supposed to be here. Like a month or more premature, came out feet first. Incubator, so I breathed in.
We are currently listening to a conversation I had with Zach Norris after a screening of Fundi, the story of Ella Baker, where we explored the continuities and implications of the praxis of Ella Baker in our now moment. Zach Norris is Executive Director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, author of We Keep Us Safe, Building Secure, Just, and Inclusive Communities, and co-founder of Restore Oakland, a community advocacy and training center that empowers Bay Area community members to transform local economic and justice systems and make a safe and secure future possible for themselves and for their families. Zach is also co-founder of Justice for Families, a national alliance of family-driven organizations working to end our nation's youth incarceration epidemic. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Continue to enjoy the program.
I know I ain't gonna stop. Hustling hard, plus my trust is in God. Right now I'm studying Islam, eating nothing with law. Pray for the day the radio will play something to art. My part gotta suffer free alarm. And as soon as one come on, it'll go to the next song. Why they faking Hercules when they ain't that strong? Self-proclaimed dope, but it ain't that raw. Alhamdulillah, I need to say that more, because my ceiling ain't but 12 feet above my floor. Soon as you sure about something, it change around. Up in this game, you crime, then the next wave you drown. To my kingdom, it's a humble one. If you wanna come up, you know where I'm coming from. My kingdom is a humble one. If you wanna come up, you know where I'm coming from.
Ordinary women, when you actually have, as history interestingly always tends to do, is that when you're looking back, she's celebrated. But I'm quite sure, and you listen to those folk, particularly in that film, and then you listen to other folk who kind of give you the inside, right? To give you the inside that she wasn't really liked in the context of that. So, and she seemed to have done a very, very good job in navigating that space. And it seems like nothing was going to stop her. Obviously, she had that nonstop or that continuation energy in her, right? Could you talk a little bit more about the importance of that, not allowing something to just stop you, or not letting you find a way around it? Because I'm called to mind, let me just encapsulate this. When she was in the conversation in the movie with the young man, she was like, oh, he kept saying everything that was stopping him. She was like, well, hey, you need some help, right? And then he was like this. Could you talk a little bit more about how her understanding was very, very important?
Yeah, I mean, as Barbara Rensby talks about in her book, Ella Baker was not a sprinter. She was a long distance marathon runner. And I think, it's as a light-skinned African-American man who grew up in East Oakland, and the Bay Area being a particular place, like, I can only imagine what it was like for Ella Baker growing up. And I think that her persistence comes from lived experience, right? And if you look at the trajectory of her life, like she, worked at the NAACP, worked at, was a mentor for SNCC, like worked at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and dealt with and had to deal with patriarchy throughout her life and racism, obviously. And so when she's talking with folks, it is always with an that deep understanding behind it. And I think what I take from it is just that kind of that framework of always understanding that the person she's talking to has the answer, and really asking more questions than answering. And that like takes a certain patience and a certain like self-confidence that I think we often underestimate, right? We often associate the most confident people with the people who are like willing to step in front of the room and just do the big speech, but like the folks who are actually able to sit and listen and to draw out, I think reflect a different kind of confidence and wisdom that she just embodied throughout her life.
I wanted to weave in a question from
Yeah.
someone who is here. One of the interesting things here, someone talked about Ella Baker's internationalism and Pan-Africanism and the anti-imperialism of clear in the film. But someone actually to piggyback or actually to expand upon this, the idea that you just presented. Someone said that, and I'm not sure if they want me to call her names or not, but I'm just going to say someone.
Sure.
I believe that Miss Baker was somewhat critical of a single charismatic figure as the leader of movements. When we look at today's movements for Black lives, does the present day move, or they kind of resituate the question here, do the present day movements confirm or challenge the notion of a single charismatic leader?
Yeah.
I think that's a better way to answer that.
Yeah. The way I see it, the present day movements are challenging the notion of a single charismatic leader, and are challenging notions of patriarchy inside of our movements. When you look at the emergence of Black Lives Matter, the leadership of Opal Tometi, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, Brittany Pack, and so many other Black women, I think that that in and of itself is different than the Black freedom movements that we have been talking about. And I think a significant advance that is not to be, just kind of sneezed at or whatever. That being said, I think the mainstream media and the media apparatus is always looking to kind of like idealize or idolize certain figures. And there should always be a resistance to that, because if we are going to build movements powerful enough to kind of take down authoritarian figures, we need that kind of broad base of support. And and so from my perspective, work has been accomplished and work remains to be done.
And it seems that, I guess we got a flood of questions here. And I'm going to try to do the best that I can to kind of consolidate some of these, because there seem to have some themes here. One question from somebody that I actually am very familiar with, want to address the Africana womanhood that Ella Baker embodied. She comes from a tradition of Black women who understood that they were stewards of their community. And again, and to really understand, and I wanted to open with this, to really understand Ella Baker, we have to understand Ella Baker in a continuum, right? And I mentioned this earlier, is that you also have Satima Clark, you also have Annie Hamer, who they're in conversation with. And I think specifically is that we probably can look back at her time in Harlem as she really, because she went to Harlem, as she says, to really, because she wanted to know. Right. Yeah. She was very, 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 very intent. Whatever she didn't know, she sought it. Could you talk a little bit about that in the context of mothering or womanhood as being the teachers and educators of communities and nations?
Yeah.
Because she embodied that.
Yeah, she absolutely did, but in a complex way at the same time, right? Because here's someone who also embodied this kind of like matriarchal role in terms of supporting SNCC and supporting youth leadership, but at the same time was very private around her own personal life and around her long-term marriage. And so did so in a way that was absolutely kind of a radical Black feminist, and before that was a kind of coined term. And so that's some of my thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question as well.
Well, no, I mean, it's very interesting because it's funny because when we were looking at this film, and let me say a little bit more about myself as well. I'm actually a part of Africa World Now Project, who is co-sponsoring along with African Diaspora International Film Festival. These film festivals, we've been doing it for a number of years. That's just one of the things that I do. We also have 2 radio programs that we have. One is on Pacifica Radio Network, and we also have another program in North Carolina that actually was on before we got here. And I was talking, and as we were talking about this film, and we were talking about how we're going to have this conversation, interestingly enough, I actually just taught about Ella Baker in my Black Radical Tradition class this past semester. But the way I taught Ella Baker is that I taught her in conversation with Winnie Mandela. And one of the things that we find is that in an international context, and understanding the connections and the constant connections with Ella Baker, particularly in Harlem, is that she was part of the Women's League that was there. And interestingly enough, is that the same people or the same ideas that developed in Harlem, the radicalness. Was interesting, the connection that we have at WSSU with Maddie Hall Zuma, who was married to A.B. Zuma, who was the first president of the National African National Congress in South Africa, went to Africa. She's an African-American. Maddie Hall Zuma is African-American, graduated from WSSU, Winston-Salem State, born and raised in Winston-Salem, marries the A.B. Zuma. He goes back to South Africa with her, and they're at the beginning, are the embryonic stages of the African National Congress, and she starts an African women's organization specifically modeled after the same organization that was going on in Harlem at the time. Wow. So the same ideas and the same environment that really kind of formulated Ella Baker also had impact on Winnie Mandela as well. Mm-hmm. So that is a very, very that's a very, very interesting connection there. Mm-hmm. And we have another question that wanted to look at Ella Baker, any interactions with Garvey, C.L.R. James, and Kwame Nkrumah. I would say being in Harlem. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, at that particular time, come on. Speak on it. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, do you have any perspective on that? But I'm really understanding this in the international context. I think things internationally, right?
And it's interesting because I think one of my formative moments as an organizer really came. I was a law school student, and I was doing a semester abroad in Argentina, and I got word about this human rights delegation to Colombia, and to stand outside of Cartagena and to learn about the ways in which folks escaped slavery in ways that were similar to what happened inside of the United States and formed Maroon communities, and to sort of understand myself and ourselves inside of a tradition of resistance across 2 hemispheres within across 2 continents within the Western Hemisphere was really important. And I feel like that I can only imagine that must have had kind of a similar impact on her to be able to situate what was happening inside the United States, inside of a global context, right? Because there's a way in which I think any of us can normalize our experience if we don't have some of that perspective. And to be in Harlem at that time would have been to have a global perspective, right? And so, I would love to, I was fascinated to learn about what you just described, so love to hear.
Yeah, no, so HBCUs are important in the context of this. Of course, the development, the intellectual development, the social, political, and cultural development if you talk about Nkrumah, you talk about CLR James, you talk about Ella Baker, you talk about um, Queen Mother Moore, you talk about Vicky Garvin, all of them who actually also influenced Malcolm X that was in Harlem during that particular time. So I think that there's a lot to be said here, and we probably be here all night, but we're not going to be here all night. But someone else, it looks like they have a question here as well. But just to kind of talk about this, you talked about yourself, and I actually was going to ask you a question. How has Ella Baker influenced your? This is a 3-part question, but also this is a question that I think that could be thrown out to the audience as well. And I'll talk as slow as possible. How has Ella Baker influenced your work? How did you discover Ella Baker? And what does Ella Baker mean to you in the context of your particular position, but also as a person who's really trying to figure things out, just like we all are, right?
Especially right now. Oh my gosh. It's a lot to figure out. I actually heard about Ella Baker through the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, which I think is powerful in and of itself. The Ella Baker Center was founded by Van Jones and Diana Freer in 1996, and really started its work challenging police violence, and also believing in the power of young people in particular to make change. And one of the kind of flagship campaigns of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights was to get Officer Mark Andaya fired for the killing of a Black man named Aaron Williams, and really flipping the script around how he was portrayed in the media. Another instrumental campaign was challenging Proposition 21, around the turn of the century, which led to the criminalization of youth of color. But what was so powerful in the Bay Area at that time was just so many young people coming out and basically rejecting all of this politics of folks calling them the super predators, et cetera. And I was a young person myself at that time. And I remember coming back from college, and I went to Harvard as an undergrad. And so I'm seeing young people in the streets, taking over intersections and doing the damn thing. And I remember sitting in an intersection and I'm just looking up at this stoplight. We had taken over the whole intersection. I'm just drawing a picture. I drew this nice picture of the stoplight itself, and I pretended a sign that was coming down from it that said "No on 21." And I still have that. When I look at that picture, I think about just how powerful I felt, because I was just doing something that I did, right? I enjoyed doing art. I wasn't an organizer or anything, but I found something that I could do in that moment, in that space, just by sitting and being there and doing something that I knew how to do. I later learned that Ella Baker Center had helped organize some of those protests and were involved in that fight, in that struggle. But to me, that moment is a reminder of when I'm doing my best organizing in the tradition of Ella Baker, I'm remembering that moment myself, where I found a role and a place for myself within a movement and something that I could do and be a part of. And so I think that's been her influence on us as or on me, but also on the organization, right? Because the organization has a long history, and I think that at times we've had to really self-correct and say, are we living up to this name? Are we really responding in the tradition of Ella Baker, and being as radically inclusive as we could be? And so in that sense, I think, it's been really a call to action in terms of not just what we do, but how we do the work as well. And I felt like I left off 2 of the questions you asked.
Yeah, no worries. I'm gonna follow back up.
Okay, right on.
This is my radio. I'm gonna always follow up.
Right on.
But no, you're there, right? So you're in this context because it's also in the context of being there and you developed within the context of being there. You understood, because not only were you there, did the picture understood that not only are you executive director of the Baker Center, but you also co-founded Restore Oakland, right? You're talking about Oakland. You also you're the author of We Keep Us Safe, Building Secure Jobs, Inclusive Communities. So community, institution building, but also being able to envision beyond struggle, I think is important as well, because the artists are the the cultural component of movement is very important, because this leads us to a question, particularly about can you discuss the power of music that has been used by Ella and others in the civil rights movement?
It's something that I remember with a very particular example. We have been fighting this campaign to close youth prisons across the state of California, and folks were putting it on the line, showing up outside of these youth prisons to the very institutions where they knew their children and grandchildren were inside of these youth prisons, were worried about them being abused. And we had over time seen some success, and actually saw one of those, I think a couple of the youth prisons closed down. And so we were doing this kind of celebration of these families who had led this struggle. We did it at a church in Oakland. And one of the most powerful moments was when we all were singing, and then just came, and everybody, it was probably like 300 people and maybe 12 family leaders in the center. Everybody surrounded them and just kind of put hands on them and just expressed our admiration, our support, our encouragement. And there's something about music and the rhythm of our breath, and that fortifies us. And I don't think we still to this day really recognize that enough, or incorporate that into our movement building, into our actions as much as we should. I personally wish I had more capacity as a singer, more capacity as a musician. I unfortunately did not get past high school in terms of music, but for me, I think, it basically is the rhythm and the heartbeat of what we do. And I don't think that we value that enough. I do see positive examples here and there. Shout out to Youth Justice Coalition, some of the folks who are challenging the sheriff in Los Angeles, who just put out a really cool mixtape around defund the sheriff that people should check out on Spotify. But those are some of the things that come to mind for me. And it's funny because when the Ella Baker Center was doing its work to one of the first campaigns I was involved in, we helped stop what would have been the largest per capita juvenile hall in the country from being built. And at the time, a lot of the rap on young people was that, oh, they're listening to this rap music and it's influencing them in negative ways and blah, blah, blah. And so we kind of embraced that and said, what we're doing is actually hip hop activism. We're engaging young people. When we would go to the Board of Supervisors meetings, and we would hold poetry slams right there in the middle of their meeting. And the best thing, Dr. Pope, about bad poetry is that it's still good protest, because you're still taking your 2 minutes. I did some of I did my first and my last ever public poem at one of those protests, right? And I think, it gives people that agency and that power of their own voice. And sometimes that comes out well, sometimes it doesn't, but it is rooted in kind of what's here in our hearts.
And to piggyback off of what you're saying, and I agree, particularly it was something I actually was talking to my son. I'm actually it's interesting because you're on the other side of the country. I'm here. We have these conversations, which is great, because I'm in the DMV area. And of course, when everything kind of broke out, I went out and I was out and about, just really trying to get the pulse of what was going on, but also trying to really figure out, like, not really intellectualize anything, but really understand what was happening, because it was different, right? It is different.
Yeah.
There's something, I wrote a piece that came out in Board magazine that talked about, this moment is trending towards unprecedented. It's trending towards unprecedented. There's still things here, but one of the things that really, and I was talking to my son, I have a 15-year-old son that I actually took out there with me as well, is that one of the things, the way the cadence, there's a difference. And I want to piggyback what you're saying, that I do agree, but there's something there. There's a cadence of, when you listen to the music of coming out of SNCC and coming out of, the Deep South and other places, and they're using it as protest, than the chants that are coming today, right? There's a different cadence there. So I think that it has everything to do with the context of when you're in movement, or you're in resistance, and you're using the vibrations of sound, and you're organizing that to make music. What you're doing is you're also calling the ancestors, right? Mm-hmm. So what you're doing is you're inviting the spirit of the ancestors, those who are resisting and who have always resisted, right, to come into that. So I agree with you. Yeah.
Just the power of the drum, and the power of that invocation, right? I think about the Toy Toy in South Africa, and I remember seeing recently Movement for Black Lives kind of doing this very cool invitation to some of their work, where there was, the music of the Toy Toy and images from South Africa, but also current modern day images of the struggle being kind of interspersed. And so definitely new and different moment, but also, as you said, kind of a resonance and an invocation of our ancestors at the same time.
And to take this to an international level, and an Africana perspective, and an African world perspective, is that, Al Cabral talked about culture as being the rise in culture, or the rise in cultural production as being the forerunner into resistance, or being a forerunner into movement. So once you start to see a rise in the creative forces that people are using to resist, because I'm thinking about Richmond, Virginia. Have you seen the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond, Virginia? How they have literally taken over that, and completely that. When I saw that, as a person who actually lived in Richmond, Virginia for a large point of my life, still have family in Richmond, Virginia, and also understanding that history of the Monument Avenue of being nothing but Confederate statues with Arthur Ashe way down at the end. And one of the things, as a quick note, as a side note, I know everybody is kind of celebrating what's happening around that now, but there's a long history of Black folk in Richmond moving against and trying to get rid of those monuments that I think that needs to be put into context as well. That's my little side note. There's a little side note there. Absolutely. But the point being is that
recognize the organizing.
Right. Because that becomes important. And again, and that's what Ella Baker understood, right? But she also understood that in the context of institution building. So as a leader of an organization, and there's something else that I think that we need to talk about when we're talking about Ella Baker, is that she had a critical understanding of not only of other people or what was happening in society, but she understood herself. So the level that she had to take, or the confident humility, I would say.
That's a great description. That's what I was trying to get at earlier, that confident humility. Yeah. Go ahead
and talk about it, because she understood that, because you're a leader of an organization, right? So what is it? So as a leader of an organization, what lessons have you taken from Ella Baker that you use? And then I'm gonna put you on the spot here. What are some things that you think that you can improve upon, not only within the context of what you're doing, but you're in communication with other organizations, right? Yeah. You're in communication with other folk. What are some things that you see that Ella Baker can offer you as a person who's a leader of organization?
Yeah. On the first front, like as a young organizer, the confidence isn't there, right? And so I remember being in spaces and feeling like, okay, well, what am I going to say? How am I going to interject? And really being focused on myself in a less than confident way. And I think as you engage in a number of different organizing spaces, then you start to see, I don't need to be worried about what I'm going to say. I need to be thinking about how can I be of service to moving this work forward. And so some of my proudest moments as an organizer with at the Ella Baker Center have often been when people didn't know that I was the executive director at the Ella Baker Center, right? So I remember, you know, someone newly coming back in the role as the executive director, and we were planning an action to stop the BART trains from moving forward, really calling attention to the murder of Mike Brown, and really trying to add our kind of grain of salt to nationwide protest post Ferguson. And, you know, it was really just about what's the tactic, what's the action? Okay, Zach, you're going to talk to the conductor of the train, and that's going to be your role, and try to, you know, keep him calm. And the beautiful thing was, it was a brother, and he was so happy. He was like, he made an announcement on the PA. He was like, there is a nonviolent protest happening in honor of Black lives, and he did it better than I could have. So I just appreciated that. But I say that to say, like, I was part of a group of, you know, 30 folks who were organizing and participating in that action. And I think had I came in and said, you know, well, I'm, you know, this is my title and blah, 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 people have been like, well, what's your motives? Why are you really here? And instead I was just, you know, I'm committed as the same as everybody else. And, you know, sometimes there's organizational stuff that, and to your point around what can we still learn? I think sometimes the organizational stuff still comes with you, right? And then people kind of get to know you, not just as you're trying to participate and help move the whole thing forward, but kind of come to see, oh, this organization has this end and that one has this end in mind. And I think, you know, some of what we need to practice is listening, but also trying to really speak to, be able to disabuse folks of that organizational beef or whatever comes with it. And just to be able to say, look, I understand we've gone through it, and to really continue to build restorative justice and transformative justice as part of our practice, right? Because for eons, we didn't have punishment in prisons and exclusion of people. We really had community processes to hold each other accountable. And that's something that I think organizationally we're trying to lean into and still build out further.
And that's important, because it's interesting how you said, you know, people didn't recognize that you were the executive director. So imagine, you know, me, I get the same thing. It's like people have no idea, you know, that I'm a professor, and I'm cool with calling me James too. You don't have to call me.
Okay, right.
Because, you know, we come from certain traditions, right? Yeah. And this is what I think is important: the confident humility that one has, that be able to don't see themselves as different than the people that they are either teaching or that they're in community with or that they're trying to work with, right? So I think that is important, and Ella Baker is an example of that, right? Yeah. She was at home the most with the workers, with the people who were organizing on the ground. So she had a very, very clear vision, right? And which is interesting, because it seems to me that, you know, organizations today, and you can correct me, or you can expand upon it, or you can debunk this or expand upon this, is that, do you think that organizations such as Ella Baker Center or other organizations who are community-based or they're organizing, what is that relationship? Let's do a critical analysis of, do we have a strong enough relationship to the communities that we say that we are actually working on behalf of, or working with?
We don't. I mean, I think the straightforward and simple answer is that we don't, that there are so many aspects and facets of life that have been intentionally deorganized, right? And depoliticized. And that includes our faith institutions, that includes community-based organizations, and nonprofit organizations, that includes our labor sector, right? And I think the honest reality is that we find ourselves with an authoritarian president who invokes himself as the savior of white folks, and in typical authoritarian fashion is saying, "I will keep you safe," right? Meanwhile, he is causing the harm. It's the abusive "he keeps us safe" lie, right? It's a lie of abusers that actually are committing the harm. Meanwhile, they're saying they keep us safe. And this model of like actually building community safety from the ground up, this deep felt connection with community from nonprofit organizations, labor organizations, faith institutions. I think we all have a lot of work to do in this moment, because it is a function of society fracturing, that we don't have the institutions to really hold community in particular ways. And, you know, I think that it's a big contradiction that we're still grappling with, right? Because so much of a lot of the energy around the civil rights movement was in an integrationist framework, right? And what we were, as I think Malcolm X said, you know, integrating into a burning house almost, right?
Dr. King was saying.
Thank you.
You're right. No problem.
And so in that context, you know, I think that, you know, we have a lot of work to do to think about and to act on how we can serve as kind of healing spaces. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do with Restore Oakland. So we were able to purchase this 18,000 square foot building, which is going to have a dedicated space for restorative justice and transformative justice. One of the first in the country, really putting a counterpoint to this kind of law and order, prison focused vision of safety, to say this is what safety looks like. Is going to house a restaurant run by formerly incarcerated folks and others who have been locked out of opportunity. Causa Justa Just Cause, a housing rights organization helping people fight gentrification, which is a key issue in the Bay Area. I say all of that to say, like, we're trying to create a space that is of service, of use, of utility with community in a way that isn't just about the organizing and the advocacy and the kind of being out in front and power to the people, but is really about connecting to folks' basic needs. And I think that's the piece that we still have to do, and was intentionally decoupled, right, by the nonprofit industrial complex in particular ways, right? Because the Black Panthers were doing the free, you know, Feed the People program, and they had this ethos that was integrating service and integrating organizing, and everything got professionalized and disbanded in ways that have actually undermined movement. And I think we have gotten too connected to some of the master's tools in that regard, and to chasing behind the grants and all of those things. And I feel like there's starting to be a sensibility and an opportunity for people to be able to understand those tools, to relate to them to a different way, and to connect to community in a different way. But it's a work in progress.
Oh, I mean, and it's very important work. And what you're doing and what you said, particularly about space and about the use of space, of what I would call a Black commons, creating a space. And again, this is what I see that Ella Baker was doing with SNCC, was creating a platform that was a space where people can get together, develop perspectives, get orders, right? Go out, carry on, but also engage in critique of self, and engage in critique of others in the context for progressive and forward movement for the collective. So the space part becomes important, because one of the things that you say is that if you look at the industrial complex, and you look at, and shout out to the revolution will not be funded by Insight, the women of Insight who developed that particular book. And if anybody gets a chance to really get that book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, because it's a very important, because what has happened is that once you start to take the space away, and then you start to make people pay for space, or pay for, different things, or people start to think that you need money to organize, right? One of the things I like to talk about is guerrilla organizing. Organize it with no money. Create the space that is consistent, that people can come to, heal, talk about things. And I think that is important. And it seems like that's what you were doing, or that's what you're doing.
And to be real, from my perspective, resources are necessary. The Black Freedom Movement, even though there wasn't necessarily a nonprofit structure, there were folks who were supporting the movement in different ways. And that kind of grassroots organizing and fundraising is something that I see a lot of organizations really moving towards greater self-sufficiency and sustainability through either developing their own enterprises, but also through really looking to expand the number of individual donors who support their work. Because, by percentage, regular people give way more money than anybody else. And there's an opportunity, I think, through that to actually sustain the work from the community in the ways that you described.
And to piggyback off of that, and I'm glad you really talked about the resources, really reimagining what resources are. And there's a very good book that talks about the idea of cooperatives, or cooperative economics, Collective Courage by Jessica Numbrot, that talks about the history of cooperatives that were supporting movements and people in the context of self-sustaining communities. And what you're saying is very important. And also what you're saying, in the context of what's happening today, we have to think about that, right? We don't have folk, they are really tightening up those who are in power. We're clear about those who are in power. They're clear. We should be clear, but they're very clear, right? They're very clear about what they're doing. I don't, sometimes I wonder about us if we're clear or not. But can you talk a little bit about the activities of the center that they are doing? You talked about what you're doing with the space with Restore Oakland. Can you talk a little bit about what the center is doing as well?
So we advance what we call a truth and reinvestment agenda. So really trying to lift up the long history of racial injustice in the country and to redirect resources towards jobs, not jails, books, not bars, healthcare, and housing, not handcuffs. And that is done through organizing, advocacy. We're currently working to get people out of prisons across California. There's as folks may have heard, COVID-19 is taking the lives of our brothers and sisters in California prisons. And we have been pushing the governor, along with so many other organizations, Californians United for a Responsible Budget, and so many other organizations doing that work. We have been calling out our sheriff, who we call the Joe Arpaio of the Bay Area. We call him the Bull Connor of the Bay Area, somebody who's retweeted the alt-right, whose office has retweeted the alt-right, who has hosted Oath Keepers. And you like to think like, oh, this is a liberal Bay Area, but this sheriff is renting jail beds to other counties. And we have been pushing for an audit of his finances as a way to begin to redirect resources away from his office and towards social supports. We've had some success in that work. We were part of a campaign called Jobs Not Jails, where we successfully campaigned to move the county to move $10 million annually away from the sheriff and probation department and towards community-based supports for folks coming out of our local jail. And, one of the things is like, sometimes you have victories and you think they're victories, but they're also failures. And so we were successful in moving that money, but then once the money was moved, the county was issuing RFPs, and a lot of the same nonprofits, the ones you talked about with no connection to the community, but who did the best at, filling out that paperwork and doing the RFPs, were getting those contracts. And so part of the rationale and the impetus behind Restore Oakland was really to show and prove what we mean by community development when done in the interest of community members, And it really came about as a result of some community-driven research we did with 20 different community-based organizations across the country that resulted in a report called Who Pays? The True Cost of Incarceration on Families. And I say that because that report received a lot of media attention, but it was all on the problem and not on the solution that families were putting forward. And so what we tried to do was basically create a visual aid around what those solutions were, and that is the building called Restore Oakland. So we do our work on the organizing front, and we use disruptive power, we exercise political power, economic power, modeling power, and different strategies to advance our work.
No, that's great. And I actually have 4 more questions, but I'm not going to do that right now because we actually over time, and I wanted to make sure I acknowledge that, and do appreciate you, taking the time to talk with us, to talk about the impact of Ella Baker. And we have to talk about Ella Baker in the context that she is still here. She's still amongst the ancestors informing us. We just need to listen a little bit more, but also I think that enough of us are, and we really, really thank you for taking the time. Is there anything that you would like to say as we close this conversation? Anything that we might have missed, or anything that you came in burning to tell us?
No, I mean, I would in some ways start or end where I started, which is just to say that Ella Baker was a long distance runner, as Barbara Ransby has so effectively noted in her biography. And I think that we should, in this conversation with that intention, is really about understanding that we are in a long struggle and we have an opportunity in this moment to take advantage of it, but understand that we're in a long game. So I just appreciate everyone for joining, and want to appreciate your work, James, for really lifting up her legacy, and appreciate the invitation to speak with you all.
No problem. I'm glad to meet you lady over there.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Muizu Mutali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funda Ngunda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior researcher and content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.